Maybe. Maybe the most important part of building a cathedral is the moment before any work begins at all, the moment of imagining a possibility that a soaring stone structure could rise above a medieval market and connect heaven and earth. It was a generations-long project to build a cathedral. Notre Dame in Paris took more than 100 years to construct. So maybe the most important part of that process is laying the foundations. For Notre Dame, they began, before a single stone went up, they began by digging down 30 feet below the waterline of the river that surrounded that island, digging down to find earth that was solid enough, strong enough to hold the footings that the whole building rests on. Cathedrals are traditionally oriented with a long axis east to west. Building starts east and then it moves progressively west. So you raise one set of arches, one vault, and then the next, and it takes so much time that in some places the styles and the flourishes and the decoration changes over the generations of architects. And a trained eye can see the handwriting of the stonemasons changing over time through the building. As you raise the walls up in one section, the roof pressing down makes them bow out, so you buttress them, keeping the walls from falling off to the sides. And maybe this is the most important part of the process, the steady, patient, painfully slow work of raising the walls and holding them fast. But then maybe the most important part of the process is the repeated rounds of rebuilding. The buttresses built in the 12th century are taken out and replaced in the 14th century. Stained glass gives way to clear glass when that becomes the fashion. The pillars are covered in tapestries, and then the tapestries are removed as tastes change. A century of neglect and then restoration in the 1800s, a catastrophic fire just a few years ago burned out the wood and metal roof, and now reconstruction again. Maybe the most important part of building a cathedral, the most important part of any act of creation, is tending to it over time, is rebuilding. Cathedral thinking means an attitude, an orientation of being involved with projects that may not be finished within our lifetime, or even several lifetimes. Projects that nonetheless are worthy of our effort. It's not just about buildings either. I think about in 1853, it was the Unitarian minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker who wrote that his eye could see but a little way, could perceive only a portion of the arc, the moral arc of the universe, but from what he could see, he thought it was bending towards justice. His work, the full liberation of Black people in a country which acts as if Black lives don't matter, which acts as if immigrant lives don't matter, Indigenous lives don't matter, queer lives don't matter. His work is not done. That's cathedral thinking, too, the work of justice unfolding across generations, and we are still at it 2 centuries later. Cathedral thinking isn't just about buildings. Communities do it too. We're going to expand this building. The building design team has been hard at work selecting an architect and figuring out what it will look like. You'll hear so much more from this fall. It will take much less than a century. But the real cathedral project of this community, the difficult cathedral project of this community, has been unfolding for 30 years. Some of you know this story, but it's important to return to it. The minister here in the 70s and 80s, Forrest Whitman, profoundly betrayed the trust of the congregation. He used his power and influence to coerce members of the congregation into sexual relationships. And in 1993, when it became public, he didn't take responsibility, he didn't face accountability, he resigned from the church. He resigned from the UU Ministers Association before either body could take action. He burned through a catastrophic fire. And for many folks here, then, the behavior was obviously reprehensible. And for many other folks who were here at the time, they didn't see the coercive power at play in what he was doing. They didn't understand that real consent requires mutuality. And just like that doesn't exist in your relationship with your doctor or your therapist, it doesn't exist in your relationship with your minister. But for many folks here a generation ago, there wasn't that clarity. And half the congregation wanted to kill him, and the other half wanted him to come back again. And in the months, the years that followed were bitter and mean and ugly, and partisans on both sides of this shouted each other down and sent mass mailings out to the congregation through the postal mail then, denouncing and insulting each other. Barb Richards, who was the president then, says she about wore the gavel out. Could have used a sledgehammer instead of a gavel. But I tell this story because that isn't where it ends. The story of the congregation is not about people who were just wounded a generation ago, but also about people, a community who healed. It took a long and painful time. Some of you were here in those years. Some of you felt the legacy of those years when you showed up in the 2000s, even though you didn't know a thing about what made the feel of the place so strange back then, why people were so ready to fight with each other. It took a long and painful time. In 2006 to 2007, the congregation at last went to work on making a covenant of respectful relationships. They said to each other, what matters is how we treat each other in community. What matters is the agreements that we make with each other about how we're going to act to each other, how we're going to behave. And that wasn't something that came from the minister then imposed or the board. That was something that came from the whole congregation up, saying the way we've been with each other can no longer be the way that we are with each other. 30 years ago, there were a handful of people who could imagine this moment right now, this moment in the life of our community. When that was 30 years past, 30 years ago, there were folks who laid the foundations for it in shared values and year by year buttressed it with covenant and relationship, who tended to the interconnections of people and how we treat each other and how we repair fracture when it happens again and again and again. Reverend Kelly Dignan, my predecessor here, one of the Masons, building a cathedral of community. She liked to talk about this sort of work not as building an edifice. You've got a blueprint and then you construct it perfectly right. She talked about this work as tending to a growing, a living, an interconnected system. Covenant, Reverend Kelly would say, covenant is a promise to connect. It's a promise to tend to the roots, not just the trees. It's a promise to operate out of interdependence, not individuality. And this community, 3 decades later, knows it in our bones. I'm going to tell you a story about tending trees. This is going to be a quick, arborist lesson, and then we're circling back around again. All right, in Meghalaya in northeastern India, there are rubber fig trees. These are great big things. They're 100 feet tall. They have a dense canopy at the top. The trunk is 6 feet across. They have great big buttress roots which come out from the trunk to hold them up. And like banyan trees, they have aerial roots. They spread out their branches, and then the branches drop roots down to the soil. I've never seen that. I don't think there's anything like that in North America, at least this part. In the mountain forests there, the Khasi and the Jaintia people take these aerial roots growing down and they weave them across rivers to form living bridges. Sometimes they'll lay a log first or set up scaffolding. Sometimes they'll even run a simple steel suspension bridge with steel cables. And as the steel rusts and rots away over time, the roots grow solid. With years of care and patience and growth, the living root bridge grows all the time, constantly. They can last for centuries. The oldest is over 200 years old. They strengthen as they age. This is cathedral thinking. Not in the form of perfectly replicating the blueprints planned out in advance, but as an act of trust, as an act of plan and discovery, as a work of co-creation passed across years, interdependent with the trees, interdependent with their ancestors and with generations still to come. On any given day of that work, there is no visible progress whatsoever. You never come home from working on this and say, hey, I built a bridge today. There's no point at which that happens. Nonetheless, it is what you're doing. And that's the way community works too, slow growing, patient, co-created. It's the way our own spiritual life and growth works too, most of the time, I think. And that's the invitation in this house. No hidden wisdom, no power or privilege, no guilt or shame to control you, no escape from the beautiful and difficult reality of being alive and having to die. Only this, a community gathered to be who we are and become what we're called to be. Slowly, day by day, that's what we're doing. When we sing and sit silent, when we place stones, when we listen to the still small voice of conscience with every bit of our being, when we listen in small groups, listen without fixing or saving or giving advice, listen only to understand another person's experience. That's the work. And sometimes the most important part of that work of your own growth and tending, is imagining the future that you're working towards someday. And someday, the most important part of it is laying a strong foundation in simple, solid acts of service, of joy. Sometimes the most important thing is steady, stone by stone building, week by week, seeking connection and humanity and humility, finding beauty, coming back home into your own body again and again and again. And sometimes the work is about rebuilding, making repair after something you wish you hadn't said or done. It is slow growing work, patient, perpetual work. The poet Marge Piercy writes this, called The Perpetual Migration. She says, how do we know where we're going? How do we know where we're headed? Till we, in fact, or hope or hunch, arrive? You can only criticize the comfortable, say you don't know what you want, but we do. We always knew peace, plenty, the gentle wallow of intimacy, a bit of Saturday night and not too much Monday morning, a chance to choose, a chance to grow, the power to say no and yes, pretties and dignity, an occasional jolt of truth the human brain, wrinkled slug, knows, like a computer, like a violinist, like a bloodhound, like a frog, but the seabird on its 4,000-mile trek follows charts mapped on its genes. The brightness, the angle, the sighting of stars shines in the brain, luring till inner constellations match outer. The stark black rocks, the island beaches of wave-worn pebbles where it will winter, look right to it. Months after it's set forth, it says home at last and settles. Even the pigeon beating its short whistling wings knows the magnetic tug of arrival. Driven as a migrating falcon, I can be blown off course, yet if I turn back, it feels wrong. Navigating by chart and chance and passion, I will know the shape of the mountains of freedom. I will know. This is the fire of a commitment that burns in us. This is our cathedral thinking, to navigate the ocean of our lives by chart and chance and passion, till inner constellation matches outer. Day by day, we make no measurable progress, but we make of our whole lives living bridges passed to us from ancestors and handed to the future.